There is a particular kind of silence that settles over an athlete's world when the body refuses to cooperate. It is not the silence of rest, nor is it the silence of preparation. It is the silence of absence, the absence of sneakers squeaking on hardwood, the absence of a crowd rising to its feet, the absence of the very thing that defines you. For Caitlin Clark, that silence lasted 239 days. 239 days. Say it slowly and let the number breathe for a moment. That is not a brief interruption. That is not a scheduled break or a planned vacation from the sport. That is 8 full months of watching the game continue without you, of sitting on the edges while your profession moves through its rhythms and rotations, of working in gyms and training rooms and quiet spaces without the validation of a real game, a real crowd, a real scoreboard. For most athletes, 239 days away from competitive basketball is the kind of absence that rewrites careers. It changes how defenses study you. It changes how coaches think about you. It changes how fans begin to wonder about you. For Caitlin Clark, 239 days away from competitive basketball was apparently just enough time to prepare the greatest individual statistical debut in the history of international basketball. What happened in Puerto Rico in early 2026 is the kind of story that resists easy summarization because the numbers involved are almost too extraordinary to absorb in one sitting. 14 FIBA world records across 7 days. A tournament MVP award that had never gone to a younger player, never gone to a debutante, and never gone to a player who came off the bench in 4 out of 5 games. A television viewership record for any FIBA qualifying event in history. A plus-minus of positive 80 across the entire tournament. An efficiency rating of 14.6 that led every single player from every single country in the entire qualifying field. But before we get to any of those numbers, before we understand what they mean and why they matter, we need to understand what 239 days actually cost Caitlin Clark, and why coming back from all of it the way she did was about as improbable a thing as women's basketball has ever seen. Athletes are conditioned to speak carefully about injury. There is always a careful management of language, a deliberate navigation between honesty and the vulnerability that comes with admitting how hard things actually were. Caitlin Clark is better than most at this navigation, but even she could not fully conceal the weight of the 2025 season and everything it cost her. It was not one catastrophic injury, not a torn ACL, not a ruptured Achilles, not the kind of traumatic single moment that at least comes with a defined timeline and a clear story of recovery. Instead, it was what Clark herself described as nagging injuries that kept building on top of each other, one problem multiplying into another, a cascade of physical setbacks that never quite resolved before the next one arrived. She played in only 13 games during the WNBA season, and by her own admission, some of those appearances came while she was probably not healthy enough to be on the floor at all. That is a particular kind of purgatory for a competitor. The complete shutdown of injury, as brutal as it is, at least provides clarity. You are hurt, you cannot play, you heal, you return. The in-between space that Clark occupied, always trying to come back, always hitting another wall, always pushing through and then pulling back, is psychologically far more grinding. She described it herself. It played with her mind more than knowing she was going to be out for a set period of time. There was no set period. There was just the uncertainty, the repeated hope, and the repeated disappointment. When she finally made the decision to shut things down entirely and commit to a full recovery, she gave herself something she had not really had through the entire back half of 2025. Time. Real time. Uninterrupted time in which the only goal was getting healthy, getting strong, and getting ready to be herself again. And she used every day of it. The first checkpoint came at the USA basketball training camp, which she later described as a genuine revelation. She had half expected to come back feeling foreign to herself, to need days or even weeks to rediscover her first step, her timing, her feel for the game. Instead, she felt like herself almost immediately. The work she had put in during those 239 days had not just maintained her baseline, it had in some meaningful ways built on it. She walked out of that training camp not just relieved but genuinely impressed with where she was physically and mentally. Still, the coaching staff entering the Puerto Rico qualifying tournament treated her return with the kind of care you extend to something valuable and fragile. She would come off the bench. Her minutes would be managed. The load would be spread across the roster. There would be no rush to hand her the keys to the entire operation. This was the right instinct as a protective measure, and it would turn out a strategy that she would systematically render irrelevant within 19 minutes of taking the floor. Picture the scene in Puerto Rico. Team USA is in the middle of their opening game against Senegal. The crowd inside the arena is already electric, already buzzing with the specific energy of knowing something significant is about to happen. And Caitlin Clark is not on the floor. She is sitting on the bench in her warm-ups, watching the game unfold, waiting for the moment the coaching staff decides to check her in. She later said that she thought she was going to be anxious about this moment, the return to competitive basketball after nearly a year away, the pressure of expectations, the weight of everything that had been written and said during her absence. Instead, she felt nothing but excitement, pure, uncomplicated excitement at the prospect of getting to play again. There was nothing to be anxious about, she suggested, because there was nothing she had lost. She still knew who she was, she still knew what she could do. The 8 months away had not changed that. If anything, they had sharpened it. When she checked into the Senegal game, the clock said she had approximately 19 minutes of playing time ahead of her before the end of the first half. 19 minutes to reintroduce herself to the basketball world after 239 days away. She scored 17 points. She dished out 12 assists. She committed 0 turnovers. She shot 4 for 5 from three-point range. She went a perfect 5 for 5 from the free throw line. And in those 19 minutes, she broke 7 international basketball records that had been sitting in the FIBA record books for years, some of them for decades. Let's take those records one at a time, because each one deserves its own moment of appreciation. The first record was the most assists ever recorded by any player in a Team USA senior national team debut. Not just women's basketball, men and women combined. Every player who had ever suited up for the United States senior national team for the very first time, going all the way back through the history of USA basketball's senior program. Clark did not merely break that record, she doubled it, in 19 minutes. The first record was actually the smaller version of itself, because what Clark did was not just a Team USA achievement. Her 12 assists in that debut game were the most ever recorded by any player making their senior national team debut for any country in FIBA competition. Any country, any era, any gender. Every nation that has ever sent a team onto a FIBA court, and no player in their debut game had ever done what Clark did that Tuesday night in Puerto Rico. She came off the bench in her first ever senior international game and shattered a record that encompassed the entire documented history of organized international basketball. Record 3, her 12 assists were the second highest single-game assist total in the entire history of FIBA qualifying tournaments, across all games, all tournaments, all countries, all time. Second in history, in her debut, off the bench, after 239 days away. Record 4, most assists by any player coming off the bench in all of FIBA history, not just qualifying tournaments, all of international FIBA competition, every level, every format. Bench players simply do not put up numbers like this. Clark did it in her first 19 minutes back from an 8-month injury layoff. Record 5 is the one that, more than any other, illustrates the specific quality of basketball intelligence that separates Clark from every other player operating at this level. In the first half alone, she had 8 assists and 0 turnovers. 8 assists, 0 turnovers. That 8-0 ratio in a first half represented the highest first half assist total in any FIBA qualifying game ever played. And she gave the ball away not once. 0, nothing. Complete and total control of the offense, maximum production with 0 waste in her first competitive action in 8 months. Most accomplished point guards at the peak of their careers, in the prime of their physical condition, playing in systems designed specifically to put the ball in their hands, never achieve that kind of first-half performance. Clark achieved it coming off a reserve role, managing her own return, feeling things out for the first time after 239 days. Records 6 and 7 arrived together. She posted the fastest double-double ever recorded in a Team USA debut, reaching double digits in both points and assists before the coaching staff could even fully process what was happening on the floor. And more significantly, historically significantly, she became the only player in FIBA history, men or women from any country in any era, to record a double-double in their very first senior national team debut game. Not the fastest. Not the most impressive, the only one. It had never happened before anywhere under any circumstances, until Clark walked off the bench and did it in 19 minutes. 7 records, 19 minutes, game 1 of 5. Here is where the story develops a complication that is worth examining with genuine honesty, because what happened next is simultaneously understandable and, in retrospect, somewhat baffling. Clark broke 7 international basketball records in her debut. The coaching staff watched all of it happen, and then they decided to keep her on the bench for 4 of the 5 remaining games in the tournament. There are arguments to be made for this approach. The original philosophy entering Puerto Rico was about roster balance, spreading the minutes and the production across the full team, giving everyone meaningful contributions, building depth and cohesion. Caitlin Clark is singular, but Team USA is not a one-player operation, and the coaching staff was right to be thinking about the whole picture rather than just the most obvious star. There was also the legitimate concern about managing her workload coming off such a long injury absence. They were, as they put it, in fact-finding mode. They wanted information about where she was physically, how she responded to game intensity, how she held up across multiple days of competition. These are reasonable considerations, and the problem with them is that the information they were gathering was unambiguously pointing in one direction from the very first night. Clark led Team USA in points across the full tournament, coming off the bench. Clark led Team USA in assists across the full tournament, coming off the bench. Clark led Team USA in plus-minus across the full tournament, coming off the bench. Clark led Team USA in efficiency across the full tournament, coming off the bench. Not just Team USA, the entire qualifying field, every country, every player, every game from the bench. It was not until assistant coach Nate Tibbetts began making adjustments, moving Clark into the starting five, building a three-guard lineup around her alongside Paige Bueckers and Kelsey Plum, and explicitly organizing the offense to run through Clark's playmaking, that Team USA began to look like the dominant force they were supposed to be. When Tibbetts made those adjustments in the Italy game, the results were immediate and decisive. Team USA won by 34 points. Clark's plus-minus in that game was plus 27, which was not just the best number on Team USA that night. It was the highest plus-minus recorded by any player from any country across the entire 2026 FIBA qualifying tournament. Every team, every game, every player. Clark off the bench, playing in a system that had finally been built to fit her, produced a number that nobody else in the whole competition could approach. Tibbetts later acknowledged the obvious, that the earlier approach had not been right, that running a pace and space system built around Clark's playmaking was clearly the correct path forward. It was a forthright admission and a meaningful one, because it underlined something important about what the records Clark set during this tournament actually represent. She broke them while operating inside a system that was not designed for her, not built around her skills, and not using her in the role that her talent demanded. She outperformed the structure. She exceeded the framework. She set world records while essentially working against the architecture of the team's tactical approach. The records she set while coming off the bench happened despite the system, not because of it. If the Senegal game was the opening statement, the games that followed were the paragraphs that turned that statement into a fully articulated argument. Night by night, game by game, the records accumulated with the steady inexorability of someone who had simply decided this was going to happen. The Italy game, which became the turning point in terms of how the coaching staff deployed her, was where Record 8 landed. Playing 22 minutes off the bench before Tibbetts made his adjustments, Clark posted 12 points and 5 assists. The plus 27 that we already discussed. 8 records in 2 games, each one erasing something that had been sitting in the record books as a seemingly permanent benchmark. Game 4 against New Zealand was where the record that arguably means the most to Clark's legacy as a playmaker fell. Chelsea Gray had held the all-time tournament assist record, with 22 assists accumulated across an entire qualifying tournament. Gray is one of the great floor generals in the history of women's basketball, a player whose passing and vision have been celebrated for years as among the best the sport has ever produced. Her record was not some incidental mark, it was a genuine benchmark of elite international playmaking. Clark passed it during the New Zealand game. She did not just edge past it, she did not squeak over the line. She finished the tournament with 32 total assists, a 45% improvement over the previous all-time record. And she did it in 4 games coming off the bench with her minutes carefully managed and a coaching system that had only recently been adjusted to let her do what she actually does. If Clark had been deployed from the opening tip of the tournament in a system built around her playmaking, the mind recoils from imagining what the final number might have looked like. 32 assists in a qualifying tournament. The old record was 22. The new record is 32, and it belongs to someone who had not played competitive basketball in 239 days. By the time the Spain finale arrived, the records and the tournament MVP discussion had become inseparable. The award itself was never seriously in doubt. No player from any country in the qualifying field had produced anything close to what Clark had produced across 5 games. But the specifics of what winning the MVP actually represented, the layers of historical significance wrapped around a single trophy, are what elevated the moment from impressive to genuinely extraordinary. Record 10, Caitlin Clark became the youngest player in FIBA qualifying tournament history to win the MVP award. Youngest ever, across the entire documented history of the competition, across all countries and all eras. She was 24 years old when she accepted that trophy, and no player younger than her had ever won it before. Record 11. She became the first player to win tournament MVP in the same tournament as their senior national team debut for Team USA. In the entire history of USA Basketball's senior national team program, stretching back through decades of international competition, nobody had walked into their first tournament wearing that jersey and walked out with the MVP award in the same 7 days. Clark did it in her first week. Record 12, first MVP by any player making their senior national team debut across all countries. Not just Team USA, every nation competing under FIBA going back as far as these records exist. Nobody had ever done it. The debut game and the MVP award in the same tournament for any player representing any country had never happened before. The combination of things you need to achieve simultaneously for this record to exist, perform at an MVP level while doing so in your very first senior international games, is so demanding that in the entire history of organized international basketball, it had never been accomplished. Until Clark. Record 13 may be the most telling of all, in terms of what it says about the unique circumstances of this tournament and the unique nature of Clark's performance within it. She became the first player in FIBA history to win MVP while spending most of the tournament coming off the bench. MVPs, across essentially every sport and every competition format, come from starters. They come from players who log the most minutes, play in the most prominent roles, and have the most opportunities. The structure of most competitions essentially guarantees this. The player of the tournament is almost always the player who played the most. Clark won it spending 4 of 5 games as a reserve. It should not have been possible, and it happened anyway. And then there is record 14, which is not a basketball statistic at all. The tournament set a television viewership record for any FIBA qualifying event in history. The largest audience ever assembled for this specific type of competition tuned in to watch Caitlin Clark's return to international basketball. The numbers shattered previous marks for qualifying tournament viewership in a way that made the comparison almost uncomfortable in its lopsidedness. This record matters in a different way than the others. The first 13 records are about what Caitlin Clark can do on a basketball court, the specific quantifiable expression of her talent in the universal language of statistics and performance benchmarks. The 14th record is about what Caitlin Clark means to the sport of basketball and to the culture that surrounds it. It is about the fact that her return after 239 days was not just a sports story. It was an event. It was something that people across the world cleared their schedules to watch, that drew in viewers who may not have known Chelsea Gray's assist record or cared about FIBA qualifying formats, but who wanted to see what was going to happen when she came back. That is a rarefied category. That is the kind of cultural gravity that very few athletes ever generate, and that even fewer sustain across injury and absence and the relentless scrutiny that follows the most visible players in any sport. Let us stop here and look at the complete statistical portrait of what Clark produced across these 7 days in Puerto Rico, because the individual records only tell part of the story. The full picture requires seeing them together. Across 5 games, Clark posted 32 total assists, a new all-time FIBA qualifying tournament record, surpassing the previous mark by 45%. She accumulated these assists while playing restricted minutes in 4 of the 5 games, while coming off the bench for most of the tournament, and while operating in an offensive system that was not built around her playmaking until the 3rd game of the competition. Her plus-minus across the entire tournament was positive 80. That means that every time Clark was on the floor, Team USA outscored their opponents by a cumulative total of 80 points. In a tournament where Team USA won every game, Clark's presence was the single most predictive factor in the margin of those victories. Her efficiency rating of 14.6 led the entire qualifying field. Not just Team USA, not just players in her position. Every single player from every single country who competed in the 2026 FIBA qualifying tournament, coming off the bench, in her senior national team debut, after 239 days away from competitive basketball. She led Team USA in points, assists, plus-minus, efficiency, and free throws, all 5 categories simultaneously, while being used as a reserve. When the coaching staff finally committed fully to the 3-guard lineup with Clark, Bueckers, and Plum, when the offense was actually built to take advantage of what Clark does, Team USA looked like a different team entirely. Faster, more fluid, more creative, harder to guard. The ball moved with a rhythm and purpose that defenses could not adequately prepare for because the combinations were coming too quickly. The reads were arriving too fast, and Clark's presence as both a scoring and playmaking threat required every defense to make a choice between two things they could not both cover at the same time. Of all the things that emerged from Puerto Rico, the pairing of Caitlin Clark and Paige Bueckers may be the development with the most immediate and lasting implications for Team USA, for the Indiana Fever, and for women's basketball as a whole. Bueckers is already one of the most celebrated players of her generation, a shooter and scorer of remarkable quality whose game complements Clark's in ways that are almost suspiciously perfect. When Clark drives, Bueckers finds the corner. When Clark is covered off the pick and roll, Bueckers is already moving off a screen into space. When Clark advances the ball with those get-ahead passes that seem to travel 3 steps ahead of where the defense expects the play to be, Bueckers is already there, already set, already rising. In the Italy game, after Tibbetts committed to running the 3-guard lineup, Bueckers scored 12 points. Against Puerto Rico in the final game of the tournament, she put up a team-leading 16 points. These are not the numbers of a secondary piece. These are the numbers of a co-star in a system where both leads have the capability to be the primary driver of the offense on any given possession. The combination creates a specific kind of problem for defenses that has no clean solution. To contain Clark's playmaking, you need to deny her the ball or crowd her with help, which opens Bueckers on the perimeter. To contain Bueckers as a shooter, you need to track her off screens and through every cut, which leaves Clark with space and time to read the defense and find the right play. There is no coverage that eliminates both threats simultaneously because they exist in different places and require different types of attention. Add Kelsey Plum, one of the most dangerous offensive players in the women's game, a scorer who can create off the dribble and from 3 at an elite level, and the 3-guard lineup becomes something that functions almost like a theoretical problem for opposing coaches. You are trying to cover 3 players who can each score 20 points on any given night, who each make the ball move more efficiently when it passes through their hands, and who each read the game at a level that puts them in the top tier of players their sport has ever produced. The margin for defensive error is effectively 0, and the margin that defenses actually have when executing against this lineup in real time is somewhere well south of that. When Tibbetts acknowledged that running this kind of pace and space system built around Clark's playmaking was clearly the right approach, he was essentially acknowledging something that Clark herself had been demonstrating statistically from the first 19 minutes of the tournament. The most effective version of this team is one where the offense begins and ends with Clark's vision. Clark spent 7 days in Puerto Rico doing something that no practice, no training camp, and no amount of off-season preparation could replicate, proving that a pace and space offense built around her playmaking works against elite international competition in real game conditions against real defenses. This matters enormously for the Indiana Fever heading into the 2026 WNBA season, because the blueprint is no longer theoretical. It has been tested and validated and decorated with 14 world records in a competitive setting against some of the best defensive players in the international game. The Fever's path forward is clear: push the pace, move the ball, let Clark make reads, build spacing around her vision and her ability to manipulate defenses with the threat of both her shot and her passing. The version of the Fever offense that functions at its highest level is not one where Clark is a piece of a larger system, it is one where the larger system is a piece of Clark's game. The injury troubles of 2025, as frustrating and extended as they were, may ultimately prove to have been a blessing in disguise in one specific way. Clark came out of the recovery process with a renewed physical foundation and what appears to be an even sharper mental relationship with the game. She said she felt like herself almost immediately in the training camp environment, and what she produced in Puerto Rico suggests that the version of herself she found in recovery is at least as dangerous as the one who left. The Fever have pieces around her that can work. Bueckers, depending on how her own transition to the professional game develops, could be a co-star. The 3-guard combinations that Team USA experimented with in Puerto Rico are not specific to the international game. The principles that made them effective in FIBA competition are the same principles that create advantages in the WNBA. If the Fever commit to the system that these 7 days in Puerto Rico demonstrated so clearly and convincingly, and if Clark stays healthy, and there is always the fragility of that condition, the knowledge of what 2025 cost, they have the foundation of something that could be genuinely special. Clark is 24 years old. She is the youngest player in FIBA qualifying tournament history to win the MVP award. By the time the 2028 Olympics arrive, she will have had 2 full WNBA seasons from a healthy baseline, a complete World Cup cycle with Team USA, and the Puerto Rico qualifying tournament as the foundational international experience on which everything else is built. The question of who leads Team USA into the next Olympic cycle was, heading into this tournament, still theoretically open. There were names to discuss, arguments to be made, cases to be presented. After Puerto Rico, after 14 records and a tournament MVP and a TV viewership record, after the +80 and the 32 assists and the 14.6 efficiency that led the entire qualifying field, the conversation is effectively settled. Clark is the face of Team USA women's basketball. She is the player around whom the international program will be built for the foreseeable future. The Clark-Bueckers backcourt is the core. The 3-guard lineup with Plum is the weapon. The pace and space offense built on Clark's playmaking is the identity. None of this is imposed or assumed. It is simply the logical conclusion of what the numbers demonstrate. You build the team around your best player, and when your best player is also the most impactful in plus-minus, the most productive in assists, the most efficient across the entire competition, and the only player who has ever recorded a double-double in their senior national team debut, the decision about who to build around is not particularly complicated. The 2026 FIBA Women's Basketball World Cup will be the next major chapter. By then, Clark will have a full year of competitive experience back under her belt, a rhythm re-established, a role clarified, and a coaching staff that has learned in the specific, somewhat costly way that experience teaches, that the best version of Team USA runs through Caitlin Clark. The lessons of Puerto Rico will have been absorbed. The adjustments that Tibbetts had to make mid-tournament will be the starting point rather than the corrective measure. And by 2028, when the Olympics come back into view, Clark will be 26 years old in what should be the absolute prime of her basketball powers, leading a team that has been assembled and organized around her for 2 full cycles. We come back at the end to the record that has no box score, the television viewership record for any FIBA qualifying event in history. It would be easy to treat this as a footnote, a nice marketing data point, a number to cite when making the case for Clark's commercial value and media appeal. It is all of those things, but it is also something more meaningful and more interesting than any of those descriptions suggest. When the largest audience ever assembled for a FIBA qualifying tournament tunes in to watch someone return from 8 months away, what they are really doing is voting on what the sport means to them. They are saying, collectively, that women's basketball is worth their time and attention at a level that nobody had actually measured before. Because the previous viewership records for this type of event, however strong, were the records of a sport that had not yet had Caitlin Clark at full strength in a major international setting with the story of her return to tell. What the viewership record tells us is that the ceiling for women's basketball's audience is genuinely higher than even the most optimistic projections had suggested. And Clark is the reason that ceiling keeps rising. She does not just bring casual fans, she brings people who may not have followed women's basketball closely before, who tune in because of her specifically, and who then find themselves watching Paige Bueckers get open off a screen for 16 points against Puerto Rico and think, this is actually extraordinary. These players are actually extraordinary. This game is worth watching. The conversion rate from Clark viewers to women's basketball viewers is the most valuable commodity the sport has right now. Every time Clark performs at this level in a high-visibility setting, the pool of people who understand what women's basketball can be gets bigger. And once that pool expands, it does not easily contract. People who have watched Caitlin Clark find a cutting teammate with a no-look pass at full speed do not easily forget it. The viewership record in Puerto Rico was not just about Clark. It was about what Clark makes possible for every player in the sport. The expanded audience, the elevated attention, the cultural validation that comes from knowing that the largest crowd ever assembled for your type of competition showed up because they wanted to see what happens next. Throughout all of it, the records, the MVP, the viewership numbers, the coaching adjustments and tactical revelations, there was Clark herself, speaking in the understated, precise, direct way she has always spoken about basketball. She said she relied on her work, that the hardest part of the injury period was not the physical recovery, but the mental knowledge of how much effort she had put in going into the 2025 season, only to have the games taken away before she could fully express it. She talked about the nagging injuries that kept building on each other, the way uncertainty played with her mind more than a defined recovery timeline ever could have. She talked about finally shutting things down and giving herself the sustained time to actually heal. And then she talked about the training camp checkpoint, about feeling like herself almost immediately, about being impressed by how sharp she felt and how quickly the game came back into focus. Not anxious, excited, nothing to be anxious about because she had not lost who she was, she just needed to find her way back to expressing it in a competitive setting. The quote that perhaps best captures what happened in Puerto Rico came after her first game, when a reporter asked her about the experience, and she said that more than anything, it made her happy that she was super sweaty and had gotten to play basketball. That is not a constructed, media-trained response. That is what happens when someone who genuinely loves the game more than anything else has had the game taken away for 8 months and is finally back on the floor doing what they were built to do. It is easy to project onto Clark's story, the hero's journey, the comeback narrative, the triumph over adversity template that sports media reaches for reflexively because it works. But the reality is simpler and in some ways more powerful. Clark loves basketball. She was very good at basketball. Something prevented her from playing basketball for 239 days. And then she came back and played basketball better than almost anyone in the history of international competition had ever played basketball in their first tournament. The narrative does not require embellishment, the numbers speak clearly enough. 14 FIBA world records, 7 days, 5 games, 4 games coming off the bench, 239 days away from competitive basketball, a plus-minus of positive 80 across the full tournament, an efficiency rating of 14.6 that led every player from every country in the qualifying field, the youngest tournament MVP in FIBA qualifying history, the first debutante ever to win that award, the first bench player ever to win it. 32 assists, 45% better than the previous all-time record, a television viewership record for any FIBA qualifying event in history. These are the facts of what happened in Puerto Rico in early 2026. They are not projections or possibilities or indications of future potential. They are the documented, verified, record book certified facts of what one player produced in 7 days after being away from competitive basketball for the better part of a year. There will be people who question whether it will translate, whether the international success maps cleanly onto WNBA competition, whether one remarkable tournament is enough to draw the sweeping conclusions that seem to be forming around it. These are not entirely unreasonable questions, but they are questions that come without the receipts, and Clark now has 14 of them. The return is complete. The rust, if it ever existed, is gone. The player who left for 239 days has come back as someone who just rewrote the history books of international basketball in a way that men and women across every country and every era had never done before. The game is better for her being in it. The record books, wherever they are stored, have a lot of new entries under one name. And the 2026 WNBA season, with Indiana and a healthy, motivated, history-making Caitlin Clark taking the floor, is going to be something worth watching. Keep the receipts, all 14 of them.